So Nadia, whose story I loved about these uplifting things, especially like gay Black Republican women in red areas, which sounds fantastic. And and yet I'm also reading a lot of stuff about how Trump picked up, has been picking up a lot of Black male voters. And there's also stuff about, and it's not just about Miami-Dade County, about the fact that the Democrats did not do as well among the Latinx vote as was expected. A lot of, it's not just in Florida with Cuban Americans. You'd think that these people would be like absolutely revolted by Trump's immigration policies and his rhetoric, and yet they're voting for him. That seems disturbing. Do you guys want to comment on those, let's say, disappointing aspects of this? Because they do highlight the extent to which this new Democratic Party is going to be a very complicated, fractious thing. Yes, Christina.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is, I think what a lot of folks have been saying, and Nadia's point as well, is we are dealing, we are in a, for all, I think this is true for all scholars, we are in such a moment of simultaneity of circumstances and forces. We're in such a both and moment where we have to study. We can't come up with narratives that tell us that it's this or it's that, right? So I posted this on Facebook. I was so frustrated with what I was reading, but I wrote a book 10 years ago called The Trouble with Unity. And the whole point of that book was to say, there is no Latino vote, right? There is no Latino electorate. There are multiple electorates, and there's the deep diversity of this population requires analyzing it in a way that we often fail to. Not only pundits and pollsters, sometimes Latino politics itself, I think, hasn't always wanted to look directly at its conservative elements. Like, I think that's something that the field's shifting on a lot. There's been a deep engagement in Latino studies with the diversity inside of the community, but I think the ideological question is an interesting one. So there's multiple electorates. And one thing I think, whenever we're talking about these communities, we have to think about differences in gender, age, generation, class, sexuality, education, occupation. There is no Latino voter that is just sort of generically Latino. And so I think that, so on the one hand, there's a certain kind of conservative ecosphere in Florida that I think, and I think there's been an ongoing and incredibly frustrating problem with the Democratic Party's absolute failure to work and galvanize these voters, right? Like, to really work with young voters. If you look at what Bill Nelson and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and like, there's a lot of hacks in the Democratic Party in Florida who've done a crap job with mobilizing and sitting and working in these communities. So that's just my rant about that. But I think that where you see, excitement happening is in places like Nevada and Arizona and California, where there's been all this grassroots organizing, where people have been organizing not for the Democratic Party, they've been organizing to save their own lives, right? And they've been organizing to do the kind of work they need to do to empower these communities. So, and those are the voters that are taking, Nevada, taking Nevada across the finish line. It's labor unions, it's community action organizations, it's Mi Gente and Vota Familia, and just a whole body of organizations. So I think that issue is really key. But the other part, though, that I think we have to really look at is that when you're looking at, like, because Jeff is right, you're right. It's not just, we can't just make this a Cuban problem. It's not. It's or Venezuelans, right? Like, yeah, of course, a certain kind of invocation of socialism upsets and galvanizes that electorate, in part because there's no Democrats there to argue with them on the other side. There's nobody in the community really engaging them, and there are individuals trying to, but there's no, there's not enough organized effort and commitment to doing that. But in places like the Rio Grande Valley, my dad was born in Clint, Texas, right outside of El Paso, and if you're a third or fourth generation Mexican American, working class, non-college educated voter, you're not very dissimilar from a non-college educated white voter. And I've been saying that for a while, that like those third and fourth generation Mexican Americans who don't necessarily speak Spanish. I mean, I speak terrible Spanish, but often but might feel politically disconnected or civically or culturally disconnected from their communities, or just have different interests, and other parts of them are being galvanized. I think that we need to really look at these different populations, and we need to recognize that multicultural conservatism is a thing. It's real. it's still, even with all the white national, I mean, that's what's so wild, is there's this white nationalism and white grievance politics, and yet it's still hailing in a certain portion of Latinx and Black and Asian American voters, right? So it means that there's something going on there in terms of, we have to remember, and this is like Sandy's, whiteness is a political color. It's a color of domination. And so they're hailing in a certain population. So we need to think about multicultural conservatism, but we also need to think really hard and more seriously about whiteness, which has been an ongoing failure of political science in a broad sense for a long time. Right now, yeah, there's a big story there. So I'll stop there. But I think for me, that's the big question is, we have to think about white grievance politics and the weird way that there are more women of color being elected who are conservative. Like, these things are happening at the same time, and we're going to have to think about the weird assemblage that has occurred now, and we're going to have to theorize that better than we have in the past.